in this photo. Also, several other buildings had been added. They were generating power by this time out of the Provo River. So the penstocks and some of the generation was happening here. Next slide, please. Again, another picture, very similar time frame. You can see the orchards in this one also, and some of the development in the mouth of the canyon. Next slide. I like this one because this is probably, even though the date on this says 1908, it seems to be a little bit earlier than some of the other photos that I was just showing, just based on the development in the mouth of the canyon. You can see there's two bridges across, again, one across the main river right here. And you can see another bridge right there in this photo across the City Creek. And again, that was the main supply of water, completely hand dug. But you can see the pretty strong evidence that the river was meandering, and some of the historical research that we've done in Provo City, it's interesting to see the flows that were in the Provo River, particularly in the wintertime. The Provo River is kind of a unique river where some of the higher flows actually happen in the wintertime, February and March timeframes, surprisingly high flows in the river. Next slide, please. This is a very similar photo. We actually put a couple of them together. Little closer look again. This is approximately the extension of 800 North in Orem. So that bridge right there, very close to what you currently, when you drive 800 North and head toward the mouth of the canyon. Right now, you kind of make a little bit of a diversion to the right and then up the canyon because of the entry ramp onto the road in the canyon. But best we can tell, that road used to go straight across that bridge that's in this picture here. Interesting picture. Next slide. This is a similar photo. So it looks like to me they're just kind of turning a little bit to the west in this photo. Interesting to look at what was developed. And again, it does not appear in this one that a lot of the orchards were really well established. It looks like they were starting to do some of that work in Orem. Next slide, please. Again, a very similar time frame, early 1900s, and you can see some of the water diversions in the foreground on this picture. Next slide, please. This is again turning to the west, looking at it, pretty barren picture, if you ask me, on this particular slide, and so again, just trying to give a little bit of perspective what the early settlers were facing as far as water and water supply. Next slide. Again, 1917, so this is a little bit later. You can see some more concentrated development near the mouth of the canyon. The City Creek diversion still was there, right next to this building right here. You can kind of, it's evidenced by the number of trees that are growing around that diversion versus the main channel. You can go to the next slide, please. And then one more slide, again, showing significant development from a water perspective near the mouth of the canyon. And then also, thank you very much. Thank you. This one, thank you. So you can see one other building that's added in this particular slide, some power generating going on. That building was eventually taken down. But if you walk out on, particularly walking along the banks of the river today, you can actually see many of the historical diversions still in the river. It's a very interesting walk, and kind of have to get off the trail in a couple of places and look closely along the bank. But you can still see many of the historical diversions. Some of these, you can see a train in some of these photos used to go up Provo Canyon. You can still see embankments along the edge of the river where that train crossing used to go across the Provo River. A couple of other historical things that I found interesting relative to this conference. This is a map from about 1911. This is a map of those, another map of those diversions. showing the power plant diversion, the City Creek, and several other irrigation diversions near the mouth of the canyon. We actually took this map, we found it at the state engineer's office, and it was in several, it had been scanned in several pieces. And we actually asked we have a city surveyor and a GIS specialist in Provo, and they were able to put all the pieces back together. I imagine the state engineer's office may still have the original of this, but we put it back electronically and then put it over a current air photo of the city, and we're able to orient this based on survey points to be able to find out exactly where irrigation canals used to run. So again, for Provo City, the City Creek diversion was a significant original supply of water. Again, completely unlined, hand dug. It was a significant effort for early settlers to get water supply. And it basically runs where University Avenue runs today, very, very close. So that kind of gives you an idea of where some of those, at least some of the significant diversions that don't exist anymore. This same map actually went up Provo Canyon. It's really hard to see in this slide, but we actually did a very similar exercise up Provo Canyon where Deer Creek Reservoir sits. And you can see some of the historical parts that are associated there. One other document that we found very interesting in Provo City, and by the way, we have a reference at the end of this presentation. We actually have a link that you can write down or you can ask. We got a couple of staff members here that can give it to you also. We have a link to a number of these documents. If you're interested in reading this whole document, we actually have a link, and you can obtain an electronic copy of this. But this is a 1915 River Commissioner report. The river commissioner's last name was Wentz, and he was going through a long legal inquiry, I think is the best word to use. It lasted about 20 years or maybe even more. And he was responding to some questions from the court relative to the operation of the Provo River. And I just picked some of the topics or some of the responses that the river commissioner indicated. And it's very clear from the document that they knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't, you have to realize in 1915, 1911 timeframe, there's no Deer Creek Reservoir, there's no Jordanelle Reservoir, there's really no physical man-made structures to hold back water. I'm sure that there were some, some small ones, but you have to realize this is all pre-reservoir documentation. And it's very interesting to understand they were using the ground as their reservoir system. You can see how he describes here, they used actually the three valleys up in Camas area and then in Wasatch County and then Utah Valley. They were using those systems as a reservoir system, and they would actually intentionally flood each of the valleys with irrigation water. And they knew that they could get the water out of the river, flood the valleys, and then actually conserve the water, and it would push future water or past water into the next valley. I'll kind of show you what a diagram that we drew up on this, but it's a really interesting document to read through if you want to understand some of the historic nature of the Provo River. And you can see he's basically saying, with proper manipulation of the water, the storage reservoir in the lower river in the Utah Valley, they were conserving it. They were keeping the water in the valley underground. You can see also they talk about the rock, and in this particular paragraph, and he describes it as being very coarse and very porous, and how the irrigation water would seep into the valleys. You can see each of those statements. Very, very intentional move that they were making with their water manipulation in the Provo River. You can see again, last sentence, they're focused on groundwater and maintaining the groundwater level. They knew what they were doing here. And then I like this. This is one that particularly interests me in 1915. You know, they talk about the deposits being great water conservers. I find it interesting in 1915, they're using the word conservers, you know, or conservation. They were clearly understanding the importance of water even that early. And basically understanding how they could use water multiple times. That was the significant thing that this document helped us understand. They actually intentionally used the water out of the river at least 6 times between the headwaters of the Provo and the entry into Utah Lake. The water was used no less than 6 times. In some cases, actually up to 10 times. And so multiple times they would use it for power generation. They would use it for irrigation. They would drill wells into the ground for drinking water, whether that was private or eventually public wells. And so they were manipulating the water very intentionally to be able to use it multiple times. And that's one of the big hot topics right now is reuse of water. Let's see if I can get this to go. So again, another statement talking about water and highlighted here where they understand without coming into view, you know, what they were doing with the water situation. So this is the diagram that we tried to illustrate in a couple of other presentations where they were actually putting water into Camas and actually emptying the river. In some cases, it would generate water, it would activate springs in the lower part of the Camas Valley and then push about the same quantity of water back into the river. It would go down into Wasatch County to do the same exercise in Wasatch County and activate springs, push about the same quantity of water again. And some people have asked, well, how much water was in the ground? So they don't really acknowledge the overall study, but later studies in the 1950s and the 1960s that started looking at this, they identified about 1.5 million acre feet of water underground in Wasatch County alone. That's about 3 times the amount of storage water that we have on the surface right now in Wasatch County. So again, they were manipulating the water, probably had many years. We've estimated roughly about 10 years worth of supply here. So this was not just return flow coming from irrigation canals or ditches. They were actually activating springs underneath the ground. Let's see if I can get this to go. This is another older map. This is particularly important to Provo City. This was in the 70s. We found this. This has highlighted the number of canals and the number of pipe systems that went through the city. Just the last couple of topics, I just want to make sure, let me just check my time. Am I getting close here? Okay, just a couple of quick topics that are important for Provo. So from a drought standpoint, it's important to understand that droughts, this is actually coming from a state document in 2005. It's about conjunctive management. So this is Natural Resources that published this document. And it actually looks historically at droughts. You know, some of those droughts you can see about every 30 years, 1900, 1930, 1960, about every 30 years, you get a pretty solid long drought that happens. And so planning from a water standpoint, you know, we need to understand that droughts are going to come and they're not just short term ones. This is another excellent drought study that was done. It's a tree ring study done on the Weber River. And you can see in the in the late 1800s, right, in these yellow highlighted areas, starting about 1875, they had about a 25-year drought broken up in 2 different periods by short-term, you know, good water years. But you can look at those years, extended amounts of time where drought was identified. They didn't have river gauges, but again, tree ring study, and then hit another one in the 1900s, about 1900. So while it's unprecedented, what we're going through right now, you know, from a severity standpoint, the length of drought that we're going through probably has been repeated in the past. So here's the documentation. Here's the links that I mentioned. So you can, if you want to take a picture of that, you're welcome to get on those links. Some really, really interesting documents to read through from a water perspective, particularly relative to Provo City. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, David. That was fascinating. And I'm glad we got the perspective of a city. I'm going to give a much higher view from the state perspective. I'm going to start out with a little video presentation. This is our 75th anniversary year, and we put together a nice video. So hope you enjoy that.
Water isn't just something we drink.
All right, while they do that, I'll give a little intro to myself. I'm Todd Stonley, Division of Water Resources Assistant Director. And Rebecca gave a great introduction of my background. When I was first hired in 1998 by the Division of Water Resources, they gave me the state water plan as one of my very first projects. And I like to joke that they didn't have anyone else in the division that wanted to do that, so they gave it to the new guy. And I was very
Water
grateful for that.
isn't just something we drink. It's the vital resource that shapes our land, provides wildlife habitat, offers us opportunities for exploration, is essential for our food supply, critical for our economy, and keeps us safe. 2022 marks the 75th anniversary of the Utah Board of Water Resources, originally named the Utah Water and Power Board in 1947. The board administers revolving funds to develop new water projects and refurbish aging projects throughout the state of Utah.
Almost at every board meeting, our applicants are grateful for the board and the work that the board does and the funding that they provide, because it really goes to benefit the people of the local area.
There's nothing in my mind more important than water. And the Board of Water Resources has an incredible reputation of assisting to develop Utah's water rights from the very, very smallest of communities, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 projects to multi-million-dollar projects. And without that funding, the water, in my mind, the waters of Utah would not be beneficially used to the degree that they are now. It's hard to drive throughout the state without running into a project that was funded by the Board of Water Resources.
To date, the Board of Water Resources has provided funding for around 1,600 projects, with a total dollar amount of almost $1 billion. Currently, the board is in the process of providing funding for water providers to install meters on all pressurized secondary water connections in the state, which is a requirement from the legislature to be met by 2030. The board also funds projects such as cloud seeding, dam safety upgrades, water treatment plants, irrigation distribution systems upgrades, and stormwater systems.
Some of the standout ones include Quail Creek or Sand Hollow in southern Utah. We've also had, great projects out in Vernal where we helped with reservoirs and pipelines out there. It's pretty exciting, all of the efforts that have been put in place because of the board funding.
The Murdoch Canal project was a very good project. We participated in that when I was on the board, where we piped it and put the Murdoch Trail on top of it. And that became more of a way of transmitting water from the mouth of Provo Canyon to the Jordan River. And yet they give a public aspect to it with the trail.
Well, it's a privilege and opportunity for me to be able to serve as chairman of the board for their 75th year anniversary. I just look back at the work that's been done and reflect back on the Wasatch Front and just look at what our forefathers did in that regard and wonder what would happen had they not had the foresight to implement some of the water projects that have been done, and that's been replicated across the state.
It's really great to be here right now. To know that this dam behind us that was built by the federal government now needs some upgrades that the federal government won't pay for. And our board is able to help. And we're going to get to watch what happens over the next few years and know that so many water users benefit from the water that comes through this dam. So we're helping them all. It's just really, is it fun? I guess it's fun for me to be a part of Water Resources at its 75th anniversary.
75 years. Well, being 75 years old, I think that's quite an accomplishment that the board was able to be established and be able to prosper and continue for 75 years without a lot of major modifications. I think it was set up to do a purpose, and it's from day one to today, it's still doing the same purpose and providing the needs of water needs for the state of Utah.
I am excited and humbled when I think about the last 75 years. The work that the board has done, the projects and the impact that they've made is just incredible. And I'm really looking forward to the next 75.
Join us in celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Board of Water Resources. We would like to thank the state of Utah for their continued support for projects that will improve how the state uses our most precious and vital resource. For more info about the board and other water topics, visit water.utah.gov.
All right, so you can tell we're pretty excited about what we do at the Division of Water Resources and on our board, which has a long history. So let her get that presentation going. Great, and it looks like I can advance the slides. Looks like it doesn't want me to. There we go. Okay. All right, so as the video alluded to, the Board of Water Resources originated as the Utah Water and Power Board back in 1947. And with that staff that supported that board, the Division of Water Resources has been around for 75 years. The division became the Division of Water Resources in 1967 when the Department of Natural Resources was established. So that's when we became a division, but our staff had supported the Utah Water and Power Board, which became the Board of Water Resources at that time. Okay, just to acknowledge the great staff that we have at the division. This is a photo from about a year and a half ago of about 3/4 of our staff. We have just under 50 employees, and that will be growing with all the funding that's been coming to the division in the last few sessions of the legislature to 50 or around 55, we believe. And they do great work. A lot of what I present is indicative of their work. So the mission of the Division of Water Resources is to plan, conserve, develop, and protect Utah's water resources. And that's kind of what I've modeled my presentation over. We touch on planning, conservation, development, and protection of our precious water resources. So we have a history of water planning that goes back to the Utah Water Power Board. In 1948, this Water for Utah document was published. So right after they were established as a board, they recognized the value of and importance of planning. And they produced a document that looked at the water resources statewide and how we needed to develop them and what we could do. But I just wanted to show you some quotes and give you a little summary of some of these documents over the years to give you an idea of how that water planning has evolved. So back then, this quote, they said the inadequacy of water and power supplies in Utah has retarded the state's economic growth. Consequently, plans have been prepared for the capturing of the life-giving waters in the mountainous areas for their storage and conservation in large reservoirs and for their transportation and diversion to those areas where the greatest benefit can be derived. So back then, it was recognized that there's water that's not being used, that if we could just harness it, store it, we could use it more efficiently. So that was a big focus of planning at that time, is to look at projects where that would help the state to grow and its economy to thrive. So back in 1963, there was a document prepared with support of the Utah State University. And a quote that I pulled from that says, "Our water deficiency seemed to not be not so much in the water supply itself, but in our ability to store, transport, treat, and distribute that supply." So similar tone to what they said 15 years prior. The real problem is harnessing that water and getting it to where it's needed. And this is right in the midst of several big Bureau of Reclamation projects in the state of Utah that were going on at that time. The Provo River project was already in place, but the reservoirs were being built for the Central Utah project and other projects, the Weber River project, et cetera. So that was a big emphasis back then. Then back in 1990, I didn't find a quote or one single quote that would kind of show the evolution of things. So I did a quick summary here, but this was the first state water plan that was ever published for the state of Utah. And it had devoted entire sections to topics that the previous plans hadn't really addressed or touched on, except for in passing, such as water pollution control. Of course, the big Clean Water Act passed in the 70s, so that became really big and important in subsequent decades. There was a section devoted to fisheries and water-related wildlife. This is the first place in a water plan that I could find where there's a section devoted to water conservation, and a section on groundwater as well. So that turns to the water plan that I was the primary author of, Utah's Water Resources Planning for the Future in 2001. The far-reaching vision of Utah's leaders has allowed Utah's water supply to be harnessed and used on a large scale. Water has been made so readily available, in fact, that its relative scarcity in Utah's semi-arid climate is often overlooked. This reality must be fully recognized and appropriate decisions made in order to provide sufficient water for Utah's future population. So you can see a kind of switch in tone there from the 60s, where, yeah, we've developed the water. It's so readily available that sometimes we take it for granted. And we need to change that because we don't have an endless supply of water in the state. And then the most recent state water plan. A safe, reliable water supply is critical to Utah's prosperity and quality of life. Climate scientists predict climate change will bring drier conditions and more extreme weather events, both of which we have seen in 2021. We look to science and data and continued collaboration as we prepare for the future. So we recognize that things are different now. We're in the midst of a mega drought, and climate change is there looming as a potential, very real cause of that mega drought, and things could continue to deteriorate in the future. We need to be prepared. We need to plan appropriately. So I wanted to take some of the most recent state water plan data and just kind of highlight some of the things that we do in planning. This graphic over here shows under various scenarios our demand model results for water availability for public water suppliers primarily. So this doesn't address agriculture, it's for our cities and towns. So if we took the water use rates that we had been using back in 2015, sorry, and we didn't do any conservation to try to reduce our demands, we project that these areas in the state would be short of water by the decades shown here in the various colors. So the darker the color, the sooner that would happen. 2020, 2030, out to 2070, the lightest color. So obviously that's not a scenario that we want to have, and we know that's not actually what's been happening since 2015. This is more in line with what current trends are. Things look much better. So we've conserved, we've reduced our demands significantly. The future looks better because of that. There's only a few areas that have struggles right away. And one of those is the Kanab Creek Virgin River area, Washington County primarily, St. George and surrounding areas. And then we did a more aggressive regional water conservation goal scenario where we continue to reduce our demands and improve, and the situation gets even better. So at Wasatch Front, you see in a normal scenario, we have sufficient supplies to meet that growth if we continue on that trajectory and meet those goals. But Washington County down there still has some struggles. I have two slides that kind of show that from the state water plan. This is kind of complicated slide, but basically this dark blue is the existing reliable supply. And these lighter blue colors are estimated agriculture to M&I conversions that will help meet some of our future needs. And these are those three scenarios I just talked about: the no change system demand, baseline system demand, and regional conservation goals system demand. And this is for the Wasatch metro area, which is Weber Basin, Salt Lake Valley, and Utah Valley for the most part, Utah Lake Basin. So you can see that the more we conserve, the longer that supply will last. And this kind of just depicts the very nature of a potentially diminished reliable supply due to climate change. And really just reduce that about 10% by 2070, kind of on a logarithmic scale, thinking most of that would happen later. But as you know from 2021, the water supply isn't constant, it goes up and down. So we had some major issues with water supply and had to ask the citizens to reduce their demands quite a bit the last 2 years. So this is just kind of looking at long-term averages. Then you look at the projections down there for Canal Creek, Virgin River Basin, like I said, their situation looks much more dire, and hence the state's support of the Lake Powell pipeline as a means to help provide some additional water to that area. Recent legislation that has to do with water planning. In 2020, the legislature appropriated some money for us to investigate integrating land and water planning. Surprisingly, I mean, many cities probably do that, but it wasn't formalized until 2022 that they had to include water as part of the general plan. So both of these pieces of legislation, one in 2020 and one this year, are telling local municipalities, you need to look at water as you do your general plan. It needs to be incorporated so that as you develop the lands that you have available within your cities and towns, you also have the water available to meet those needs, and you grow in a way that it's more sustainable. So those are good pieces of legislation. That brings me on to conserve. And this first bullet, it's already probably been clear of what you've been seeing from both Dave and I. Water conservation, the meaning of that has changed over time. For decades, water conservation meant capturing, storing, and putting as much water to beneficial use as possible. And that's not the way we view water conservation today so much. Still some old timers that think this way, but water conservation today has evolved to where it primarily means reducing demand by eliminating unnecessary use or waste. But you can see the water conservancy districts were all formed during that expansion period of Bureau projects, and conservancy is right in their name. They were out to build reservoir storage, capture it, and conserve it in that sense. And now we've turned to where water conservation is, the focus of water conservation is much more reducing demand. So I think that's a neat observation of the history of the meaning of that word. So just a few milestones. Like I mentioned, 1990 was really kind of the first time that water conservation seemed to have a light shown on it, at least somewhat. That section was not very long, only about 5 or 6 pages, but it was devoted to water conservation. And some of the things they said about water conservation in there actually indicated that you only do it if it's going to benefit society in some way, in terms of economic benefit. So even since then, our understanding has evolved. But then in 1994, I should mention 1992, the Central Region Project Completion Act was passed by Congress, and it required the state to look at water conservation specifically. So in 1994, Governor Leavitt formed the Utah Water Conservation Advisory Board, and they published a report with water conservation recommendations in it. So that was a big milestone for water conservation getting more interest and focus. And then the water funding boards, including the Board of Water Resources, adopted water conservation requirements for funding for municipalities as well as agricultural users who came to the board for funding. So that's really when things started to taking off with water conservation. In 2000, the governor's water conservation team was formed, and they adopted the Slow the Flow media campaign, which Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District had initiated. They all got together and we started to jointly fund that. And y'all are familiar with that program. I'm sure it's seen many advertisements about slowing the flow and using water wisely. In 2001, the goal to reduce per capita water use first appeared in the state water plan. Reducing, that goal was 25% reduction of gallons per capita day use by 2050. And I thought that's pretty significant to put that in the state water plan. And we created a web page around that in the following year. And then in 2013, Governor Herbert, I'm skipping a bunch of stuff I could have put in here, but need to be brief. In 2013, Governor Herbert accelerated that goal 25%, at least 25% by 2025. So we cut the time frame in half, kept the goal the same, and it wanted to exceed that. And by our numbers in 2015 got us really close to that, meeting that goal. So we even met it sooner than 2025. So that regional water conservation goals came in. I didn't have that on my list, but in about 2018, we developed additional goals to reduce another 16%. So in 2017, the legislature, for the very first time, I think this was very significant, they started to fund an ongoing, 5 minutes, okay, ongoing amount of funding of $750,000 for water conservation devices like smart timers on your irrigation system, toilet replacement rebates, things like that. That's on the Utah Water site that we created in 2018. And these are the regional water conservation goals that I mentioned. I'll skip over that quick. This shows our per capita water use over the years. Back in 1995, we believe we were around 321 gallons per capita day. And that, despite the changes in weather going up and down, that had a steady decline all the way to 2015, where this is a drop of about 25% if you look at it from this date, 2000 to here, that's about 25%. The reliability of this number is kind of questionable, but we know it was higher. Anyway, then there are some per capita use numbers that we've started to collect every year, showing a good trend downward. And I think you'll see 2021, 2022, with the reductions we've had, that's gone down significantly. So we're excited to see that. This is just a quick overview of some of Governor Cox's initiatives on water conservation that he threw out there last year in 2021 in the midst of the severe drought. And you can see turf buyback, water integrating land use, water planning, secondary meters, agricultural optimization. A lot has happened since then to fund those things. And here's a brief summary of those things. Secondary, sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. Secondary water meters received $250 million from federal ARPA funds. Agriculture water optimization, $70 million. $5 million for the turf replacement program, which is detailed here. And then this last legislation prohibited HOAs and municipalities from requiring turf on pieces of land that were 8 feet or less. So like park strips, notoriously hard to irrigate efficiently. Okay, so I'll go through this quickly. The Board of Water Resources, the video kind of covered this well, but this really gives you a picture of where those projects are. Literally, if you drive anywhere in Utah, you're going to be passing a project funded by the Board of Water Resources, if not multiple projects, dams, canal alignments, all sorts of things, linings and canal enclosures, all sorts of things. And then there's just a few pictures of various projects, concrete water tank in Kanab, a wooden water tank in Bryan Head that we helped fix, that had some leaks in it. Some canal lining out there in Delta, canal enclosure and lining in the Davis-Weber Canal. And this is the big Murdoch Canal. It's also known as the Provo Reservoir Canal. That was enclosed on the left, and then the Cache Highline Canal enclosure in Logan Canyon. And then some dam safety and new dam construction projects as well. All right, so that brings me to protect. I have about a minute or two. So that brings us to the last category of protection in our mission statement. For many years, this meant protecting Utah's water rights in interstate streams. So the Bear River, Colorado River, and a little bit in the Columbia River. There's a small portion of the state that flows to the Columbia River. But that has evolved out of necessity in recent years to be much more broad. And we've been given authority to do watershed councils, watershed management, try to organize people together to deal with all the issues that watersheds have. And there's a pretty good list of watershed type things that go on that we need to be concerned about today. Among them, wildfires, which isn't in that particular list there, but managing wildfires, because that can pollute our water sources and cause a bunch of problems. Here's a figure that shows the declining Great Salt Lake. We've reached record lows in recent years. It's 1961. We broke that record last summer and again this summer. But as you can see, with the cycle of weather that could rapidly change in just the course of about 25 years, it went from a record low to a record high. We sure hope something like that happens because that will help a lot in our water situation. But if it doesn't, we're planning accordingly and trying to preserve those resources the best we can. Just a visual of Great Salt Lake declines for you. A little note on Great Salt Lake stewardship. We're doing lots of activities at the Department of Natural Resources. We are involved in that effort. And there's some legislation related to that on this final slide that I think are significant. The Water Trust, $40 million going to purchase water rights and do habitat improvement to get more water to the lake and help the ecosystem. This integrated water assessment, we are overseeing that, $5 million, and we've applied to the Bureau of Reclamation for a Water Smart grant to do a basin study that'll be very similar. So hopefully we can leverage that state funding with those federal funds and a few other things there. Just a few water quotes to end my presentation. Thousands have lived without love, not one without water. Waterfalls, and kind of with the challenges that lay ahead of us, this is a great quote. Waterfalls wouldn't sound so melodious if there were no rocks in their way. So despite the challenges that lay ahead, we are ready for the task and we're excited to help the future, help prepare the state of Utah for the future and its water security. Thank you.
Lost my name tag. While they're getting this set up, I can start to introduce myself. I'm Roger Hansen. I was in the Coast Guard for 3.5 years. That's where I got my interest in water. I did a lot of environmental work, oil pollution cleanup and hazardous waste cleanup. After that, I went to graduate school at Utah State University. Got a couple of degrees there. And then I went to work for the Bureau of Reclamation, not to be confused with the Bureau of Land Management, which is in the land business. Reclamation's in the water business. We're often confused. I'm the one that's worked for the one that's in the water business. And I retired 7.5 years ago. Since then, I've been an occasional consultant for a local firm that local nonprofit that hawks technology to rural water users. I need to point out here that any opinions that are expressed here are my own and strictly my own. Frequently, my opinions went somewhat counter to the organization I work for, so I was less free to voice my opinions. But now that I'm retired, what the hell? You know, I'm willing to answer any questions you have. I don't care what they are. If you want to islands in Utah Lake or Lake Powell Pipeline or whatever, I'll be glad to answer them. Anyway, this is my subject. I want to talk about making water systems sentient. Anyway, So I'm half in the past and half in the future. And I'm too old to be in the future, but I'm going to make a stab at it anyway. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong one. Oh, down. Okay. Yeah, I'm going the wrong way. I need to point out that I'm deaf and I'm too vain to get hearing aids. So if I'm talking too loud or too soft, wave at me or yell at me or whatever. Since this is a history conference, I figured, let's get into ancient history. And when I was in Cairo, water management was largely handled by what was called a Nilometer. It's located in Cairo, and they used it to measure the elevation in the Nile River. And they used the information from that to tell what kind of a water year they were going to have, as far as helping the irrigators and the farmers know how much water they were going to have. Additionally, I guess it gave the rulers a hand up on how much taxes they needed to collect. Anyway, this thing turned out to be, if you look at modern day gauging stations, this is ridiculous, but it's almost a temple to the value that the Egyptians put on their water supply. Anyway, the state of the art years ago was a staff gauge. You'd stick it in the river, or stick it in the reservoir, or stick it in the pond, and then you'd read it, and then one way or another, you'd try to convert that to a flow. These were fairly common when I signed on with the Bureau of Reclamation. This is a strip recorder, and in order to get a history of what was happening at a given hydrologic site, they put in these strip recorders, and as the water level would go up and down, based on the float and pulley technology, it would record it. So with these, you could get a continuous record. But still, you had to go out to the site, you had to collect your strips, and you had to go back to the office, and you had to interpret them. These things were hooked to a float and pulley. Float and pulley was put in a stilling well, which was located adjacent to the open channel. And then there was a pipeline that connected the two, and this took a lot of the energy out of the water, so the float was reasonably stable. Then as this float went up and down, it would drive to the strip recorder, which mechanically recorded the level in the gauging site. And from this, you could surmise a flow in the river. Anyway, when I signed on with the Bureau, I guess this is about as far as it gotten. So this is a strip recorder with a float and pulley attached to it, and the float and pulley was just suspended into a stilling well, which went up and down with the level in the river or the pond or the reservoir. In order to get more accurate measurements, measurement flumes were placed in canals and in some cases in rivers. Anyway, with these stilling wells, with these measurement flumes, you could convert the elevation that happened in the stilling well to which gives you an elevation. You can convert it to a flow based on a rating curve for the measurement flume. Soon after I signed on with the Bureau, we started to switch from strip recorders to data loggers, and this is a data logger that's made released by a company in Logan, Utah. That was the company we decided to go with. Anyway, if you converted your sensor or your water level, instead of a mechanical device, if you converted it to an electronic device, you could collect the data on this data logger, and then they could process the data for you. And then what you'd have to do is you go out to the site, download the data, and you didn't have to sit down at a strip chart and try to convert it to usable information. The real big improvement came when communications were added to the system. In other words, you were able to communicate with your gauging station without having to go there. And so the early version of communications was a satellite. And this was run by an operation out of Wallops Island in Virginia. Anyway, so you'd take your gauging station, every hour you'd send a signal up to bounce it off a satellite. It would come down to a station in Wallops Island, Virginia. And then from there, they'd put it on a computer, and then it was available to the water users. So this gave you somewhat of a real-time information. And so this allowed water managers to better operate their systems, because they, instead of having to go out, check the site out, see what was going on, they could sit down, you know, at a computer or wherever the data happened to be and find out what was happening throughout the whole system. Eventually, but the problem with the satellite is one-way communications. It pretty much only, the site would only talk to you. It's only rare instance whether you could go the other way. So pretty soon we got interested in other forms of communication that were two-way, and radios started to fill that need. One of the specialized form of radios, spread spectrum, and they becoming increasingly popular, where you can share radio frequencies. Lately, also cell technology has been useful, where multiple gauging stations can share one cell number. So this allowed, again, you know, here on down, you suddenly have two-way communication, and you could not only query the station, but you could also send messages back to it. The advantages of real-time monitoring are fairly numerous. One, as I've already pointed out, it gives you sort of a near real-time view of what's happening throughout an entire watershed. And you don't have to get in your pickup, go out and read something. And all the information is collected, it's put on servers, and then it's dumped on the internet. So no matter who the water user is, it's available to anybody. So whether you're a kayaker, a fisherman, or a irrigator, or a culinary water user, or if you just want to know what the weather is so you know how to dress your children for school in the morning, that information is readily available to you on river basin websites. This is sort of this is just an example of the information a ditch writer or river commissioner for the White Rocks and Uinta rivers out in Uinta Basin can sit down and see what the flows are at each one of his canals up and down the river. And this allows him to better manage his river. Additionally, it also provides the water user the individual canal user, the information that he's getting the correct amount of water. So one advantage to the system is it's always, people always alleging people are fighting over water. But for these systems, the systems are transparent. And so if you're going to, if the water users want to fight, it needs to be something other than water. They can sit down and see what's happening, making sure their neighbors aren't stealing water or whatever. They can argue over who's paying the power bill. And this is just the same thing for reservoir. This is Joe's Valley Reservoir, and it tells you how full the reservoir is, what the inflows are to the reservoir in near real time, as well as what the outflow is. The Cottonwood Creek, which comes out of Joe's Valley Reservoir in Emory County, has a 10 CFS required fish release. So they can sit down on this and make sure they're meeting their environmental commitments. And then during the irrigation season, they can sit down and meet the irrigation requirements. It's sort of hard to see in this picture, but one of the advantages of having data loggers at the site are they have control ports. So then you can go ahead and mechanize your canal gate, you can automate it, and then you can change your setting from the office. You don't need to drive out there. So this allows you to better respond to changes in weather conditions, or whatever the changing situation is. The nice thing about these things is it's sort of hard to see here, but there's a small DC motor that's placed on the gate, and that turns a wheel that raises them over this gate, which puts water into this adjacent canal. The hardware for this operation sits in here, and to measure the gate position, there's a measurement on the stem here, as well as some limit switches to make sure you don't automatically crank the gate up too high or too low. And then this is a solar panel. This whole thing can be run on fairly small solar panels. Initially, we were a little worried that the solar panels might be vandalized, but in the 20 years or so of experience we've had, there's been very little vandalism. The actual power for it is a battery, which is a little more than a car battery. Yeah, so this is just one what it looks like. The battery sits in here. This is your gate position measurement, and then all your hardware sits in there. And then that cranks up and down this wheel, which raises and lowers this gate. The systems are typically sort of evolutionary. They start out with a monitoring system and develop some trust in it. And once they see the advantage of having real-time information, then they want to get into remote control. And for remote control, I mean they can move their gates physically up and down from their offices. But then the next step is you tell the gate, okay, I want to maintain a 20 cubic feet per second flow in the canal. When rivers go up and down, it tends to change the flow in a canal if you don't adjust the gate. So with by being able to put this in, the system will automatically control the flow in the gate. Now we need to go into the stuff that that I smoke pot for to come up with, and that's the river basin control. Not that I would do that, since it's illegal. The human body is situated. You have sensors here, and you have send a signal back up to your brain, and your brain then says, you're burning your finger, move your damn hand, and it moves. And that's essentially the way these systems are set up. The system gets a response. It's the water is at a certain level, and you're getting a certain flow, and it'll correct to make sure that you're meeting your management objectives. But we've really only touched the surface of the potential of these systems, because computers are advancing so rapidly, as are software programs like artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I think rather than, in the future, we're looking at a control system that controls the whole river basin. In other words, it could run essentially on its own, without human intervention. However, human intervention is possible if the system's clearly going out of whack, or you want to change the priorities in the system. And I think we have the ability to do that now, just nobody's expended the energy to do it, and they may be very specific to each individual river basin. Anyway, right now there are 3 river basins that have fairly complete real-time monitoring control system on them. The San Rafael in Emery County, the Sevier River Basin, which I think encompasses part of 6 counties in the center of the state, and the Duchesne County area. And they have a somewhat cruder system in the Bear River now. And I guess the point I want to make here is that 80% of Utah's water goes to irrigated agriculture. And so it's not too hard to figure out, where the savings have to come if we're going to meet future demands and correct for some of the situations that have occurred because of the drought. Right now, Great Salt Lake's at record lows. Bend Canyon or Lake Powell is getting so low they're having operational issues. Lake Mead's also at historic lows. So we've been borrowing from the future here, and we need to figure out how to not only correct the mistakes we made in the past, but also to meet future demands like Todd talked about. And while the governor suggested that agriculture shouldn't bear the brunt of the current drought, the practical reality is they're going to have to bear a big part of it just because they're such a large water user. And one way that you can help them meet whatever goals they are and maintain a reasonable rural economy is by using technologies like this to help the water users, the irrigators get the water they need. To provide optimal crops, you don't want too much water and you don't want not enough water. So the extent to which a ditch master or a ditch rider or a water master can get the correct amount of water to each and every farm, he maximizes the output to his to the farmers, as well as conserves water or extends his water season. So if you get nothing else out of this, we're in a dire situation. We need to do something. Agriculture is going to have to pay more than their fair share just because they use 80% of the water. But that's obviously doesn't let the urban folks off the hook. Anyway, I envision sometime in the future, river basins are going to become sentient. By sentient, I mean they're going to become self-aware, just like you have a conscience, and you're functioning as a human being. I think technology will ultimately take us there. It won't happen in my lifetime, probably won't happen, in the next 20 or 30 years. But ultimately, the systems are going to become incredibly viable just because they can be managed in such a way as to meet the needs of all the water users, irrigators, fishermen, kayakers, rafters, urban water users, etc. Anyway, so much for my ranting.
Well, thank you. Those were really great presentations. I, for one, learned a lot. And Roger, your presentation reminded me of the time at SRP when they were taking us on tour of all of their facilities, and we went into a room and we could watch these guys. They were sitting there and they were controlling like the flow of these different canals all over Phoenix. And I was just like, whoa, this is wild. I think all of these presentations talk about the institutional culture at different times and how that affects how we think about water. Roger, your presentation talks about, I mentioned that, we do have the technology here and developing technology that will help us really manage these resources. But, I think a big question that all of us are grappling with is really like, how do we get people to change? On an institutional level, Todd, you talked about, an institution changing from like post-World War II, we want to build and we want to expand and develop to by, the 2000s, people are starting to talk about, hey, we need to like think about how we're going to do this for the future. And just to illustrate that, and this brings me to my first question, and then I'll turn it over to you as an audience, because I'm sure you have questions for our audience. I live in Brigham City, and in Brigham City, we do not have pressurized irrigation. And this is something that I've wondered about for a very long time. I emailed our mayor, Mayor Bott, over the summer because I was concerned. and he emailed me back and he said, thanks for the question. The city has been studying and thinking about pressurized secondary irrigation for years now. As a policy, we've instituted some practical actions. For instance, for several years now, we have a policy we require developers to install the infrastructure at the time of development. It seems like the Achilles heel is water rights. There are a ton of individual secondary water rights. None of them have been willing to join a cooperative. At least that is my understanding. It sounds like he's not really too sure about that. And then he also added, I did forget to mention, in that last rough engineering estimate, 12 years ago would cost the city $22 million to move to a pressurized system. So the question for Dave, my question for Dave is, how did Provo pressurize? Do you know that history? And then maybe as a follow-up for Todd, like what is the general picture of pressurized irrigation and how has it evolved? Maybe you can answer those questions, maybe you can't.
So really quickly, Provo City does not have secondary water either. In fact, I think there's kind of a trend throughout the state where older cities tend not to have secondary water. Certainly, this isn't applicable to everybody, but older cities tend to not have secondary. The newer cities tend to have secondary water. And directly to your question about how they converted their irrigation, you know, from the early 1900s over to a pressurized system, we still see, in fact, we actually use elements that they converted into the pressurized system. So above University Avenue, there's a road that used to go up the canyon. It's called Canyon Road in Provo. And they actually used that originally. It's a 36-inch pipeline that was installed in the 1930s. We actually have pictures of that from newspaper articles. And it was just simply an old irrigation line that used to take the water into Provo City, and they eventually piped it and eventually built water tanks on it. And we still use that system today. So the system, the irrigation system, isn't technically all pressurized,
Right.
but they slowly had to convert. I mean, they were just forced because of water quality issues more than anything. They were eventually forced to enclose their system and convert it into a culinary system more traditional that we know today.
Interesting. Okay, great. Todd, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take you back to why secondary systems became so popular in the first place, because they were much more cost effective than treating all the water that was used for outdoor irrigation to drinking water standards and just using that to irrigate. So it made economic sense. However, in a city that's already developed, to install a secondary system, you're going to have to rip up roads and do those repairs, install lines to each system, and now meters on each of those connections. The cost difference between that and a culinary system, that gap is closing, and it may not make sense to invest the millions of dollars that it would take to do that. But there are places that do that. Morgan, I think it's Morgan City just did a secondary system in an existing part of their city because they were running short on their potable
Culinary
water.
Yeah.
So it made sense than having to expand or build a water treatment plant to provide that for everyone to take some of the ditches in town, burn them into pressurized secondary and let people irrigate with that untreated water.
Okay.
So it still may make sense, but in Brigham City's case, it may not.
May not. Right, great. Thank you for answering that. Other people's questions that we can address with that. Yes, in the back, and I. Yeah, you can. I wonder if I can do a run here.
So mine is a question about water accounting. If 80% of the agriculture is, 80% of the use is agriculture, is there any metering in what people are actually taking in terms of, like I was talking to someone on the Green River recently who has center pivots for alfalfa. And I asked him, do you have any idea of how much water you're taking out? He's like, yeah, I have a guess, but I don't really know for sure. But if he has a water right and he's going over what he might be taking and it's a complaint-based system, there's kind of a miss in the water accounting there. How do you approach that?
I know they'd look to me. We have people from the Division of Water Rights in the room, so I have to be careful what I say. But I'll just say that, yeah, agricultural individual farmers don't necessarily have a meter at their end of their ditch or at the beginning of their ditch to measure exactly what they're using. If they have a center pivot, you can that's much easier. Or a sprinkler system, it's a little bit easier to put a meter on a pipe. But those are expensive for those big type of pipes that exist. So yeah, water masters and water commissioners that oversee these systems and deliveries of water have to do their best to estimate what how much to send down the ditch, how much, and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of improvement that could be made with measuring and metering agriculture use, but it is a big cost. And that's probably the biggest impediment at this time.
Great.
You can certainly put a measuring device on a center pivot. So he, if he really wanted to know how much water he was using, he should know. I think in some areas, I think in enterprise where they're concerned about groundwater drawdown, I think there's increasing interest in measuring, the amount of groundwater that's taken out and, how much is being put on fields. About secondary water systems for urban use. For a long time, the standard water meters for pipes use propellers, and they don't work on dirty water and untreated water. The debris in the water would hang up the propellers on the meter. So it's only recently that they've started to come up with meters that can handle dirty water. And I think the state now is in the process of encouraging massive use of meters on secondary water systems. Is that right?
So this question's, I thought of it when Dave, you were speaking about the reservoirs that have been built up in Wasatch and now Utah counties. You've got the different reservoirs. And then you talked about underground aquifers and how it used to be that some of those valleys were flooded on purpose it sounds like, to charge those aquifers. I'm curious, and you'll have to excuse me for not knowing very much about how the water system works. Like, why did we choose to go the reservoir route instead of going with the aquifer route? And is there a way, how are we managing the aquifers right now while at the same time trying to manage the reservoirs?
Yeah, so that's a very direct question that pertains very much to Provo City. I think many of you know that Provo City is pretty heavily involved in an aquifer storage and recovery program, an aquifer management program. And we've spent about 5 years now studying aquifer management, and we've made some recommendations to the city and actually have support. Water resources was mentioned a couple of times in Todd's slides and film. We actually went a couple of months ago, and they provided some funding for part of a treatment plant that is directly related to aquifer storage and recovery in Provo City. And so that is one of the major concerns, and it's part of the reason that I emphasized groundwater so much in my presentation. They were heavily relying on groundwater in the supply for nearly every source of water in the past. And there has been a move away from groundwater, but I think we're getting encouraged to kind of balance that out. It can't be one or the other. It has to be both combined. And when drought hits, you have to be able to rely on, another source for a while. And so you actually have to be able to balance that supply between surface water and groundwater. And again, I referenced a document, 2005 Natural Resources published a conjunctive management. And that's exactly the goal of that document, is to balance out that surface water and groundwater supply. So it's a difficult balance, and it's one that I think many states, you can look in California, they've struggled for years to balance out that exact issue.
I can add a thought or two there. If you look at the volume of water stored in, say, Jordanelle and Deer Creek together, it would be very difficult in a spring runoff season to get that much water stored underground in the available aquifers. So that's probably the biggest reason why we were more reliant on surface storage now than utilizing our aquifers in that way.
I think probably most of you might have a way to address this. I have a friend who works for DNR, but in the Division of Wildlife. And he frequently will tell me things that he says he cannot say out loud as a representative of the state And so I'm just wondering, and this is presumptuous on my part, but Roger brought up, discrepancies between what someone believes philosophically about what should be done versus what they have to do. So how do you navigate differences as a manager of a resource when you see things differently than the way your institution wants you to conduct things?
Great question.
No, I'm not a water manager, so, but, you just try to be as honest as you can with people, and still try to maintain your job. Sometimes, you take some heat, but, it goes with a job. Take heat from both sides. It's just part of your job. I don't know if I'm deaf, so I'm not sure I understood your question.
That was a very good question. Sometimes your personal feelings about this or that may conflict with what legislature, for instance, or the governor's priorities are. So as a employee of the executive branch, you need to follow what the governor would like you to do and try not to get crosswise there. But internally, you can have discussions with your colleagues and be frank about things, how you personally feel. If you have strong feelings about it that aren't going to jeopardize your job. It's just, that's important to be professional and in that way. And I can't say that I have a lot of instances or examples where I've done that, but there have been times that I've disagreed with this or that and have spoken up. So it's not like you can't speak, but maybe publicly you have to be a little more discreet about things for obvious reasons.
Well, just a little thought to that, because that is a difficult issue and maybe a little bit different for city representatives versus state representatives, particularly in the case of Provo. The mayors that I've worked for are very supportive of thinking outside the box. And so they're not afraid to have conversations about, thinking about groundwater versus surface water and are we getting the right balance, I think the one thing that I will add, and again, it's easier, I feel like it's easier from a city perspective versus a state position. We've spent a lot of time trying to educate our residents and elected officials, particularly city council and mayors, in understanding, very difficult water issues. I mean, ranging from water rights to water management to conservation, and how they all interplay. And it's, again, a little bit, I feel like it's a little bit easier on the city level versus a state level. That's just my opinion.
When I was in school, they estimated that on water projects, 90% of it's politics and 10% of it's engineering. And after working for the Bureau of Reclamation for 3.5 years, or for 30.5 years, I sort of came to the conclusion they overestimate the value of engineering.
It's been mentioned numerous times that agriculture is using 80% of the water that's in the state of Nevada, or the state of Utah. But I want to remind is that the state allocated, they gave us that right to the farmers. And with many of the basins in the state being over appropriated, maybe the state water engineer should have maybe managed better or should have said no. I just wondering about your role as far as growing and managing that water with that, from that perspective.
Agriculture water use is a great topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it more than we used to. We have to recognize that if the water's not there in the stream for a farmer to take, they can't take it. The same's not the case for a city in terms of you can't not provide water to a city. So there's differences there. Agriculture has taken the hit whenever we've had a drought. They just can't divert what's not there, while cities have wells that they can rely on or other sources that they can use as a backup. So with that in mind, that kind of sets the stage a little bit. And also you got to consider agriculture is using that water to grow a crop that is used and provides a living for those people. Water that's put on your lawn is not you're not harvesting that to make money off of it. You might have a fruit garden or a garden in your house, but you're not on the street selling that to make a living. So it's a much different thing, and you kind of have to consider when we're going to ask agriculture to do better, that is going to have some costs associated with it and could impact their livelihood. So just things to consider in that debate.
I think we're about at time, but if there's any other last questions, this is your chance to ask any burning questions for our panelists. Okay, so 2.
Just a real quick one, some of the images that you were showing of Salt Lake, the satellite images, are there comparable images that you have available for Utah Lake?
If you know how to use Google Earth and go back and look at old images, you can find those. So yes, there are.
But other
sources of
than
those.
Google Earth, does like the state, do you as like a state have like water data on, we just get so much attention paid to Salt Lake,
Yeah.
and you know, it pulls a lot of water from Utah Lake.
Yeah, the AGRC, I can't remember what that stands for, but they have a bunch of satellite imagery that we can use as agencies as well. So I'm sure there's resources out there too.
Okay, I'll come ask you about it. You can put me in the right direction.
Final question.
So as like an interested bystander, it's easy to get the feeling like we're in big trouble, and we're in big trouble like right now. And nobody's driving the bus, and the legislature can't even decide if climate change is real, all this sort of thing, right? So it's really helpful to hear about state water plans and all this sort of thing. Is the climate in your office or in your division that, hey, things are bad, but it's, you know, we've got this plan, things are going according to plan, we're going to make these adjustments and things are going to be okay? Or are we at a point where you're rethinking the plan and be like, we need to make some drastic changes?
Excellent question. And I can kind of answer that partially, maybe not to your satisfaction, but I can honestly say that 2021 and the severity of that drought kind of caught us a little off guard. And the potential implications of that, if we don't have a good year and refill our reservoirs next year, we're still in a world of hurt. So we're at a point where we're looking at some of these projections of water supply and the impacts of climate change, that we need to do a better job of projecting those and really adapting to what we're seeing on the ground. So I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
If I can add one comment, and I may get myself in hot water here a little bit, but I think that's one of the reasons that in Provo, we've been encouraged to look at alternate thinking outside the box, as I mentioned earlier. One thing that in Provo City, again, mostly from the state help, especially DEQ, they've helped us to rebuild our wastewater treatment plant. Now, a lot of people don't understand that's part of the water conversation, particularly when you look outside the state. Reuse of water coming from an effluent, from a wastewater treatment plant is certainly a resource. And that's one that Provo, is certainly going to be prepared in 2024. We'll be prepared to be able to use that in other means. So I think cities are trying to understand we've got to take charge of at least in the case of Provo City, we're trying to say, hey, we've got to take charge of what's happening and be proactive. And it's an issue that is very, it's on us right now, and we have got to be able to respond to it and figure out what we're doing.
All right. Okay, well, we are at time, so thank you again for coming to the